Right away, the entire picture of this Lions season shifts the moment you start digging into what the playoff landscape actually looks like. And if you're a Detroit fan watching this, you already know the frustration, sitting on the outside looking in for the fourth straight week, even after a massive, gritty win over the Dallas Cowboys. That victory didn't punch a ticket, it didn't lock anything in, but it did something just as important. It kept the door cracked open. And now every week, every result around the conference, every slip by a rival suddenly feels like it carries the weight of a season. But here's where things get really interesting. When you start stacking all the scenarios, when you walk through every realistic win-loss path for the NFC, you begin to see a pattern forming, a narrative that isn't new to Detroit, but one this league seems almost addicted to replaying every chance it gets. Because no matter how big the preseason expectations were, no matter how the national coverage hyped this roster early in the year, the Lions somehow always find themselves pushed back into the same familiar role. The team stuck clawing and fighting its way toward the edge of the playoff picture, waiting for one final chance to break through. And this year, that last chance may once again come wrapped in the kind of storyline only the NFL could dream up. It involves old faces, old scars, old drama, and two narratives running parallel that Detroit fans have been living inside for years now. On one side, there's the Matthew Stafford storyline, the never-ending quarterback thread the league continues to weave into every Lions season as long as Stafford remains in Los Angeles and Jared Goff holds the reins in Detroit. On the other, there's a new twist involving Chicago, their suddenly relevant playoff position, and a head coach who once stood on the Lions sideline. When you look at the NFC math, the Bears, Rams, Eagles, Buccaneers, Seahawks, they all sit in relatively strong playoff positions. But the shocker here is how much Detroit's fate is going to hinge not just on their own final 4 games, but on what Chicago does in the exact same stretch. Every Bears result shifts the entire board. A single win swings percentages by huge margins. One loss tilts the entire wild card race. And hanging right over the whole thing is that Week 18 Lions-Bears matchup. Because if the season plays out like the scenario laid out in the file, and mind you, it's not a dream scenario, not a fantasy, but a week-by-week breakdown of what genuinely could happen, Detroit's season may come down to one final showdown in Chicago. Cold weather, high stakes, win and get in. The same exact energy we felt back in 2022, except this time the Lions wouldn't be entering the final week relying on results from other stadiums. This time, the chance to punch their own ticket would be in their hands, but so would the chance to knock the Green Bay Packers completely out of the playoff race. Think about that. The NFL loves drama. They love overlap. They love former staff versus former team. They love mentor versus protege. They love iconic matchups sitting at the intersection of heartbreak and opportunity. And this season, the Lions have all of that sitting right in front of them. If the predictions outlined in the scenario hold up, wins over the Steelers, Vikings, maybe even the Rams if Detroit manages to steal that one, everything tightens around that final game. Lose to Chicago in Week 18 and Detroit could be sitting outside the playoffs entirely while the Packers slide into the 7th seed. Beat Chicago, and Detroit not only enters as the 3rd seed, but Green Bay gets shoved out of the picture. It's the kind of setup tailor-made for the league's final broadcast slot. Game 272, something Detroit has already lived twice in the last few years. And the Stafford narrative? That's waiting too. The unresolved thread that seems to pop up every season since the trade. The unfinished business between two quarterbacks forever tied together. If the Rams stay hot and take the number 1 seed, Detroit's reward for making the postseason could be a trip right back to Los Angeles. Another chapter, another test, another moment where Jared Goff walks into the house he never got to truly call home and tries to knock out the very quarterback Detroit once built around. It feels scripted, but it isn't. It's just how this league moves. The truth is, the Lions are walking a razor-thin line. 3 wins in the final 4 probably gets them in. Anything less, and everything becomes chaos. Chicago's losses and wins move Detroit's ceiling and floor dramatically. Green Bay's stumble against Baltimore or Chicago could decide just how tight that final weekend becomes. It's messy, it's stressful, but it's also the exact kind of late-season football that fans remember for years. And now, with all that laid out, with the entire NFC shaping up into this collision course, here's what I want to know from you watching. How do you feel about this potential Week 18 win and get in scenario? And stepping right back into it, the moment you start mapping out how those final weeks unfold, the tension ramps up in a way Detroit fans know all too well. Because after walking through every remaining matchup, every divisional clash, every opponent fighting for seeding, something becomes unmistakably clear. The Lions don't just need to survive the final 4 weeks, they need to assert themselves. They need to show they're capable of finishing a season with purpose, not just potential. And what makes this stretch so electrifying is that every single outcome funnels back into that final showdown in Chicago. When you look at how the file breaks down the weeks, Week 15 becomes a pivot point. That matchup against the Rams, not just another game but another chapter in that lingering, unavoidable Stafford Goff thread, shapes everything after. In the scenario detailed in the file, the Lions drop that game, keeping the pressure sky high. But even if Detroit were to flip that result and steal one on the road, the math barely loosens. The Lions still hover between the 7th seed and the outside looking in, and that alone tells you how thin the margins truly are. Then Week 16 arrives, and suddenly the path looks manageable again. A win over the Steelers stabilizes the record. Chicago drops one in the projection, bringing the standings even closer. And then Week 17 becomes another stepping stone. Detroit takes out Minnesota. Baltimore takes down Green Bay. San Francisco outmuscles Chicago. Everything tightens. Everything funnels toward the last Sunday of the season with the Lions still needing one more push. One last statement. One last game where everything is on the line. And here's the part that feels straight out of a script, even though everything in the file comes directly from real, plausible outcomes. Week 18 becomes the storm center. The Rams take care of business. The Eagles handle Washington. The 49ers roll Seattle. And as each NFC domino falls, the stakes swell around that Lions-Bears matchup. In one version of the scenario, the one the file outlines most clearly, a Detroit loss eliminates the Lions and saves the Packers. A Detroit win launches the Lions to the 3rd seed while simultaneously knocking Green Bay out of the playoffs entirely. That's not just high drama. That's legacy-level storytelling. Think about what that would mean. Detroit walking into Chicago, freezing wind slicing across the field, pressure that could suffocate a lesser team, and instead of playing for pride like they did 2 years ago, they would be walking in with the power to control everything. Their playoff berth, Green Bay's fate, the narrative arcs of their former offensive coordinator now running the Bears, the shifting identity of the NFC North, and maybe even the beginning of a playoff path that leads right back to Los Angeles, right back to Stafford, right back to the quarterback conversation that never seems to rest. The file points out something else that should catch the attention of any Detroit fan. If this scenario plays out, this would be the 3rd time in 4 years that the Lions end up in game 272, the final game of the NFL season. The league doesn't just hand that spot out. They choose it. They select the matchup with the highest stakes, the most drama, the most national eyes. And the idea that Detroit could be that team again speaks volumes about how far this franchise has come, even with the turbulence of this season. But focusing back on the heart of this, the Lions' identity has always been forged in these pressure-heavy moments. And for a team that has spent the last few years fighting its way into relevance, this would be the ultimate test of how much that growth truly means. Winning in Chicago wouldn't just be about earning a playoff spot. It would be about proving, in the coldest, harshest moment of the season, that this team knows how to deliver when everything is on fire around them. The NFL loves narratives, and this one feels almost too perfect. Detroit, fighting for survival. Chicago, steady and playoff bound under their former Lions OC. Green Bay on the brink, hoping for a Lions collapse. Stafford and the Rams looming on the other side of the bracket. And the Lions, after all the injuries, all the inconsistency, all the setbacks, holding their fate in their own hands. So now the question becomes simple and massive at the same time. If everything really does come down to that final game in Chicago, can this Lions team seize the moment? And if they do, what do you think that win would mean for this franchise moving forward? Stepping deeper into this scenario, you start to feel how heavy that Week 18 moment would sit on the shoulders of every single player in Honolulu Blue. Because when you follow the arc laid out in the file, you realize something that almost feels surreal. The Lions don't just enter that final game fighting for their own playoff life. They walk into Soldier Field carrying the weight of multiple narratives, controlling their destiny, influencing the fate of their biggest rival, and standing in the way of a Chicago team coached by a man who helped build Detroit's current offensive identity. That's the part that really heightens everything. Ben Johnson isn't just another opposing coach. He's the architect of the Lions' creative revival. He's the guy whose fingerprints are still on the scheme Jared Goff runs. He's the mind behind so many of the plays fans still remember from last year's deep playoff push. And now, in this projection, he's the one standing directly between Detroit and the postseason. That's not just a matchup. That's a philosophical showdown. Master plan versus evolved execution. Familiarity versus adaptation. And layered on top of that is the psychological weight Detroit carries into this kind of situation. The file paints a picture that mirrors the emotional landscape of 2022, the win and get in stakes. Except this time, there's no waiting for the Seahawks game to finish. No scoreboard watching. No hoping someone else takes care of business. This time, it's Detroit's hands on the wheel. There's something powerful in that, but also something frightening, because when everything comes down to execution under pressure, you find out exactly who you are. This Lions team has been battling all season. They've lost key defenders like Brian Branch. They're waiting on Kirby Joseph to get healthy. They fought through the roller coaster of close finishes, missed opportunities, and surprising resilience. And despite all of that, this scenario still positions them one game away from the postseason, but with no margin for error. Every mistake in that final week would feel amplified. Every first down would feel monumental. Every defensive stop would feel like a season-saving moment. What makes it even more intense is how the NFC standings twist with every possible outcome. Green Bay's chances shift dramatically depending on Chicago's performance. The Bears' seeding skyrockets or collapses depending on their final division results. And the Lions, once again, hover in that narrow space between redemption and heartbreak. They could finish as high as the 3rd seed, lining up a home playoff game. Or they could be completely out of the picture if they stumble once when it matters most. And think about how the league would frame that broadcast if this scenario becomes reality. Detroit playing for survival. The Bears already comfortably in but fighting for better seeding. Green Bay fans watching the game with their season hanging on every snap. A former Detroit coordinator standing between the Lions and a postseason berth. And lurking behind the curtain, the potential reward or punishment of facing Matthew Stafford and the Rams in the playoffs. The league would eat that up. And the truth is, Lions fans would feel every second of that tension, because this isn't just about a playoff spot. It's about shifting the identity of a franchise. It's about proving that last year wasn't a fluke, that Detroit is truly building something sustainable. It's about showing that even when the season gets messy, even when everything feels unstable, this team can stand tall in the moments that define who they are and where they're going. A win in Chicago could mean another deep playoff push. It could mean wiping out Green Bay's hopes. It could mean setting up another Stafford-Goff collision, this time with even more on the line. It could mean cementing Detroit's place as a team that doesn't fold under pressure but rises inside it. And that leads to the final question that really lingers over this entire scenario, the one that hangs heavier than anything else. If the Lions manage to deliver in that final week, in those brutal conditions, with their season on the line, do you believe this team has what it takes to make a real run once they're in? And if you keep pushing this scenario forward, something even more revealing begins to take shape, something that goes beyond records, seedings, percentages, and matchups. It becomes a story about identity, about pressure, and about what kind of team the Detroit Lions truly are when everything collapses into a single defining moment. Because once you strip the numbers away and focus purely on the environment this scenario creates, you're talking about a franchise arriving at a crossroads. Detroit has been building towards something for the last 3 years. Through coaching changes, through culture shifts, through roster overhauls, through heartbreaks, through last-second wins and season-ending losses, this team has been fighting to become more than just competitive. They've been trying to become dependable, fearless, consistent, a team that doesn't shy away from the weight of expectations but embraces it. And suddenly this theoretical Week 18 matchup against Chicago becomes the testing ground for all of that. Everything the Lions claim to be, everything Dan Campbell preaches, everything the players say they believe, gets thrown into the cold wind of Soldier Field, where there's no shield from pressure, no cushion of already being in the postseason, no mathematical fallback. It's one of those games where all the cliches people use all year long finally mean something. You want to be the kind of team that finishes. You want to be the kind of team that responds to adversity. You want to be the kind of team that plays its best when the stakes are highest. Then you prove it here. The beautiful and terrifying part is that Chicago won't be desperate in this scenario. They're safe. They're already in. They can afford to make mistakes. They can take risks. They can approach the game with creativity and unpredictability because they don't live on the edge of elimination. Detroit doesn't have that luxury. Every mistake hits like a body shot. Every miscommunication feels like a season slipping away. Every penalty becomes a spotlight moment. And that's what makes this so brutally honest as a test. Because the Lions wouldn't be facing a team backed into a corner. They'd be facing a team with nothing to lose and everything to gain emotionally. Imagine how fired up Chicago would be with the chance to knock Detroit out. Imagine how badly Ben Johnson would want to prove that he can outmaneuver the offensive system he helped design. Imagine how much confidence that locker room would have playing spoiler in their own stadium against a division rival that swept them earlier in the year. Meanwhile, Detroit walks onto that field with the entire season in their hands. No lifelines, no shortcuts, just execution. And here's the part only Lions fans truly understand. This isn't new territory. Detroit has lived in these pressure games before. Sometimes they've risen, sometimes they've buckled, and the scars of those moments stay with this fan base. The near misses, the collapses, the questionable calls, the heartbreaks that shaped the narrative around this team for decades. But this new era was supposed to be different. This era was supposed to rewrite the script. And beating Chicago on the road, in this exact scenario, would be one of those victories that announces to the league, and to the fan base, that the Lions aren't just on the rise, they've arrived. Because if Detroit survives that atmosphere, that pressure, that narrative storm, then everything opens up. A home playoff game as the third seed becomes real. A rematch with Stafford becomes possible. The entire NFC playoff bracket becomes a fresh canvas, one where Detroit isn't just thankful to be included, they're a problem. They're dangerous. Their confidence skyrockets. Their momentum becomes something you can feel. The contrast is enormous. Heartbreak or validation, silence or celebration, collapse or breakthrough. And that's why this scenario, pulled straight from the file, resonates so deeply. It doesn't just map out a path to the playoffs, it maps out a moment that could genuinely define the trajectory of the franchise for years. A moment where everything the Lions have been building toward finally gets its measuring stick. So now that we've walked through where this path leads, here's the real question that hangs over the entire season. If the Lions make it to that final game with everything still alive, everything still possible, and everything resting on one win, do you trust this team to deliver? And if you really sit with that question, you start to feel the full gravity of what this scenario represents. Because this isn't just about the Lions needing to beat the Bears. It's about something much bigger, something that speaks to the core identity of what Detroit is trying to become as a franchise. This is the kind of moment that exposes whether a team is still learning how to win, or ready to take control of its destiny. When you imagine that final Sunday, the cold breath hanging in the air, the tension running through every snap, the knowledge that the entire NFC playoff picture is shifting in real time around them, you start to realize how much mental toughness it would take for the Lions to walk into that stadium and play their brand of football. Not the scared version, not the conservative version, not the trying not to lose version. The real Detroit version, the one built on aggression, discipline, physicality, and belief. Because if the season settles into the path outlined in the file, the Lions won't be sneaking into Week 18 on the back of luck or favorable results around the conference. They'll be there because they fought through the chaos of December, because they handled Pittsburgh, because they stood tall against Minnesota, because they stayed alive long enough to earn a shot at writing their own fate. By the time they reach that Chicago field, they will have already survived the emotional roller coaster of losing key players, dropping tough games, watching standings shift week after week, and living under the weight of national doubt. But here's where the moment becomes even more meaningful. It's not just the Lions proving something to themselves. It's the Lions proving something to the league. Because if Detroit walks into Chicago and punches their ticket into the postseason, they send a message to every NFC contender. Think about the psychological ripple effect that would send. A team that's battled all year suddenly entering the playoffs with momentum, confidence, and a sense of earned identity. A team that just eliminated Green Bay. A team that